So I'm just back from a road trip and diving trip. So 2,000 kilometers and 2 or 3 days worth of driving either way gives you plenty of time for reading, in a manner of speaking. Police frown upon you having a book in one hand and a steering wheel in the other, and perhaps rightfully so. But it does give you plenty of time to listen to audiobooks, a couple of which I'm going to review. And it gives you a chance to pick up on something that I don't read that much of anymore: short stories. In this case, Pat Cadigan, Patton's short stories. So short stories aren't my thing because I read too fast, they're over too soon, I read too many at a time, you forget them, they're just overall annoying. But short stories are perfect for a long road trip because you need to take a break. If you're in a hurry to get somewhere, you're inclined to hop back into the car too soon. If you've got a short story to read, you read the short story and then you get back in the car, and that works very well. I'm very glad to have finally got through this particular book. Pat Cadigan is a sci-fi author who I've heard about a lot, and a number of people have talked about their writing. I've never read any, and this book was finally gifted to me in an attempt, a largely failed attempt, to get me into their writing. I've had it for a couple of years, I've tried to read it a couple of times, and largely unsuccessfully, because me and short stories, it just hadn't worked, but this time it did. So I read it in increments during my trip up to Cairns, and I'm going to review them story by story. Now that's one of the things I don't like about reviewing short story collections, because you have to give the entire book a rating. It's like, I can't rate this entire book. Some of the stories I loathed, to be honest. Some of them were very good. Some of them I didn't think were very good. You can't just put one rating on an entire book of stories that were published separately. And incidentally, I do see the irony of me not liking short stories, but reading mostly classic sci-fi. I know that classic sci-fi as a genre wouldn't exist without short story collections, without books like Amazing. Was that the magazine? It started back in the 20s. I read heaps of short stories when I was first starting, but I didn't read as fast then as I do now. So, back to Patton's. All of these short stories were published in different places, and most of them seem to have been published in the 80s. So this collection includes ones that were published from fantasy and science fiction. But a couple of the other ones: Magazine of Fantasy, Omni, Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, all of these kinds. And every single one has a small introduction by the author first. The introductions were good and well worth reading. On to the stories. Number 1, which has tripped me up a number of times. Like I said, I've tried to read this book a couple of times. Every time the first story defeated me. It's called Patterns. It is something. It is this stream of consciousness narrative. The main character seems to think that the dot patterns on his TV are real, and that he can force them to do things, and that if they do things, in this case, assassinate the president, then that will really have happened in real life. It's not a short story. Actually, how long is this story? It feels like it lasts for a year. Oh, only 21 pages? Less than that. It's less than 21 pages. It felt like a never-ending stream of consciousness blah. Oh my God, was that annoying and boring. So annoying and boring. By the end of it, this anonymous stream of consciousness blah thinks that it has actually forced the dots on the television to assassinate the president on the television, and this is real, and then it all goes blank. Sci-fi? Nah. Enjoyable? Nah. Totally underwhelming, really. I would have forgotten it by now if it wasn't for me reviewing it. The introduction suggests that it might have something to do with schizophrenia, and I feel that it's quite likely that that stream of consciousness might be what a schizophrenic feels inside of their head. Recommended for people who want to work in mental health care? I don't know. Not sci-fi. Number 2 is called Inni Mini Ipsatini, which is a take on Inni Mini Mini Mo, I suppose. Again, it's pretty meandering, and I think I tried to read this before, and I know I hadn't finished it then. This time I did. It's a weird kind of ghosty, maybe story. There's some dude called Milo who's wandering around as an adult, and the slow reveal shows you that when he was a child living in his old neighborhood, he accidentally killed some other child while they were playing hide and seek, hence the title. And Milo seems to feel that for the rest of his life he's been followed around by the ghost of this kid, and now he's an adult and he's back in his old neighborhood and he's wandering around with some other random child for some reason, doing something, confronting the ghost, slaying the ghost, confronting his own fears. I don't know. It's just random, and it's... Ugh. Is it meant to be from the point of view of the child who wasn't a popular child and felt victimized by other kids? I don't know. Maybe. It's weird. It's boring. It's unenjoyable. It's not remotely sci-fi. I have no idea what the author was trying to do. I don't know if they managed it. I do know that I deeply do not care. The only thing that's really my takeaway from this story is the dude's called Milo and he's wandering around with a kid. Is this meant to end badly for the kid? And do people really name their children after hot malted beverages? Is this a thing? Animals? Yes. Children? Milo? Really? Or is that just an Australian thing? Who knows? Clearly an American story. Story 3. And by now I was shuddering a bit, I've got to admit. Story 3 is called Vengeance is Yours. And finally, it's a story that's an actual story and is actually interesting and enjoyable to read. This one is named after a company, title, Vengeance is Yours, that makes its bucks by organising revenge per order for profit. So whatever the client asks for, and in this case, the client is actually the will of someone who committed suicide. This is what they do to the person. It's really fun. Maybe a bit dark, but thoroughly worth reading. Not sci-fi, I feel. There might be a couple of gadgets that, if it was written in the early 80s, might be a tiny bit speculative, but actual sci-fi, yeah, nah. Story 4 was The Day the Martells Got the Cable. It's a story about cable TV and the weird installers that you might encounter. It also has a twist. Now, given that this is from the early 80s, I think that any story about cable TV is kind of de facto sci-fi, because cable TV was only just coming in at the time. This is absolutely sci-fi. And the end is a twist, which I am not going to mention, but thoroughly worth reading just for that. Story 5. Finally, we've reached the sci-fi. Yay! Roadside Rescue is both sci-fi based on the gadgets, such as the cars, and on the fact that aliens are common on Earth. It is well written, it's entertaining, it's slightly creepy, it's got a hilarious premise, and it's finally sci-fi and enjoyable. I was relieved beyond belief. Number 6. Rock On. This is a good story. Really good story with really good concepts. It's a bit obscure though. There's a stream of conscious element to it which I've complained about in the past. In this story though, it worked well enough. It's all from the point of view of a person who's a sinner. You only find out later what the sinner actually represents. It does not represent what the modern person would think it means. This is a future in which side talents are used to produce music in the way that technology would be today. The way the slow reveal of the world building through the consciousness of the narrator is really well done. I liked it. This is probably what stream of consciousness should aim for and regularly fails to do. There's a lot of little gadgetry things that are fun, like the retinal shooting scan, and there's a sticky trap to collect burglars that are trying to enter a house. There's lots of small things that get together to make it a great story. Thoroughly recommend that one. Next one, story number 7, Heal, is a funny, dark, nasty, funny take on the American faith healing scams, which I believe are terribly prevalent over there. It's more than a bit dark. I enjoyed it very much. Anyone who looks down on Barnum's principle and on faith healing scams will enjoy this one. Not sci-fi, but can't have everything. Story number 8 was Another One Hits the Road. Now this was an interesting premise, and it's more speculative fiction than anything science. It's today, or the 80s, perhaps a bit more of the 80s than today. Mobile phones don't seem to be around as much. It felt like a classic sci-fi story in that the concept was the entirety of the story. There was a narrator who introduced us to the concept and through which we saw the world, and that was how we got the ending to the story. But basically it was a concept story, and the concept was a great one. The concept was so good that one was inclined to dwell upon it and sort of bypass the narrator and the actual story. But was this intentionally done or not? I'm not sure. The concept will probably stay with the reader far past the time the story itself does. And if that was intentionally done, then it was masterfully done. In any case, it's enjoyable. Okay, number 9 is My Brother's Keeper. The intro to My Brother's Keeper was actually as good as the story itself, and the story itself is pretty good. Sci-fi, I don't know. It's a good story. It's told from the point of view of someone who's left a bad neighborhood to go to college, and she comes back when her brother sends her a letter. Her brother's an addict of some kind. It's definitely a bit not regular world, but is it paranormally, or is it alien invasion, or is it just weird? I don't really know. It's a good story. Sci-fi? Maybe not. Story number 2 was Pretty Boy Crossover. Now that was a really interesting story. Sci-fi, yes, in the cyberpunk scenario. This would totally fit into a role-playing cyberpunk type world. It would totally fit into a William Gibson story. I'm not entirely sure that it isn't inspired or related in some way to the Count Zero Overdrive books. It was a definitely similar theme in that some people could choose to become digital analogs, and the main narrator has just lost one of his good friends who's gone to become that, and the same company that took his friend wants to take him. He's resisting. It's kind of fun, and it's very 80s nightclubby in a lot of ways, but enjoyable. Story number 11 is called 2. It's a paranormal rather than anything else. It was quite enjoyable. It had a hard ending. If you can cope with the hard ending, this is a good story. And in the intro, Cadigan talks about how she was thinking about maybe turning it into a full-length novel, and if she did, I would totally read that. I did enjoy that story. Number 12 is called Angel. Again, we've got a kind of supernaturally feel, not quite here and now. And by now I was seeing a theme, and I was dwelling on the theme as much as on the story. This theme tends to be the more supernaturally type stories. You've got 2 people scenarios. You've got one person who's usually the narrator, and the object is normally the second person from which emanates the supernatural. In Angel, it's a person who's got angelic, but are they? Abilities who's come down and bonded with the person. The other person is your narrator. And that was similar to 2 and a few of the other ones, I think. Okay, number 13. Story number 13 is called It Was the Heat. In It Was the Heat, a classic businessy suit wearing corporate-ish white-collar woman goes on a conference to New Orleans and ends up being taken over by the vibe of the city, though she hates the humidity and the heat at first. She finally goes out for a drink and becomes caught up and has sex, and her husband doesn't know, whatever, stuff like that. When I started reading it, I was kind of enjoying the irony in that I had just arrived in Cairns, which is tropical and humid and probably not too different in environment from New Orleans in America, including the cyclones that we get, and what do you call them? Typhoons or hurricanes? Hurricanes over there. People who arrive in Cairns can go tropo from the heat and the humidity, like the main character, who otherwise incredibly tedious main character in It Was the Heat. I didn't like this story. I thought it was boring. I thought it was repetitious. I was impatient with the main character, who was annoying and repetitious. I skim read through most of it. I managed to read the first couple of pages, and then it was skim reading till the end, which I didn't particularly enjoy. It just made me roll my eyes. In the intro, this is described as the author's love story to New Orleans. I'm sorry, Pat Cadigan, to shit on your love story, but I've often seen this in other artists as well. They're amazing musicians or songwriters or artists. Finally, they fall in love and they write, sing, draw something deep from the heart. And unlike all of their other work, it just isn't very good, because they're trying to do something out of their genre. They're trying to be all soft and romantic instead of all metal. It doesn't work. It Was the Heat does not work. It's boring. Sorry. It is really... might be a heartfelt love story, but it's not fun for anyone else but the person who wrote it, maybe. It's got a kind of supernaturally twingy little bit to the end, but by then I didn't care at all. Skim read, not sci-fi. Please, please, oh God, never again. Number 14 was called The Power and the Passion. We went from a bad story to a good one. The Power and the Passion is a really strong, quite dark story. If you like the Dexter novels, you should like this story. Not sci-fi, but a little bit fun, a little bit horror, totally psycho killer, a bit vampire-y. Definitely more gore than in the other stories. I don't think it's particularly gory, but it's still a bit more hardcore than most of the others. So, there we have it. 14 stories. Pat Cadigan. I have finally read this particular sci-fi author. I might make the effort of reading more, but if I do, I will be quite cautious about whether I'm reading a strange love story, a stream of consciousness, oh God, please not, or an actual sci-fi. If it's an actual sci-fi, it'll probably be good. Do I recommend? Everyone's into different stuff. It might be for you.